Hey everybody, this is Jan Hatchett, your favorite jewelry lady. Once again, I'm behind the camera. Hi. Wanted to show you some quilts because one of the questions that I get asked occasionally, and honestly I think a lot of quilters get asked, is how do you tell if a quilt is machine quilted or hand quilted? And I've got some examples here that I want to show you to kind of give you an example so that you can tell if you're looking which you're looking at, machine or hand quilting. So let's take a close-up view. This first quilt with the white background is one that I made for my husband for Valentine's Day when I was pregnant with our youngest son. It is completely hand-stitched and hand-quilted. I don't know if you can see really clearly, but these stitching lines, they're not dashed lines coming down. They're going to be very continuous lines of white stitching because I used white thread. Of course, different color thread, you get a slightly different look. But this is something that on both the front and the back, I'm not sure if we can get it lit just right to show it on the back, gives you a continuous line. It's a very fast way to quilt. It's a very efficient way to quilt. And this kind of quilting became popular almost as soon as sewing machines became popular because this was a way to take scraps of fabric and make quilts to keep your family warm and beautiful decorative items for your family without necessarily having to spend a lot of money, and this allowed you to do it faster. But it definitely does give a different look. This quilt here is hand quilted. This is a quilt that I made. I did it from a kit that a friend of mine at the Gardener's Quilt store in Jackson, which doesn't exist anymore sadly, had cut for me. And it's beautiful colors. I don't know if it's showing up real clearly. The sagey greens, the sun-washed reds, and some tan. Now, I made this quilt. I stitched it together and pieced it. I did not, however, and there's the backing. I just think that is absolutely darling. But I did not quilt this. My mother volunteered to quilt this for me on her frame. She has a full frame at her house. And she volunteered to quilt it for me so that I would have a quilt that she had quilted. Now, I'm going to try to get close here so you can see the stitching. As you see in this little border, we have a zigzag thing going on here, a little zigzag back and forth. But all of the stitches, and maybe you can see it against this red, in kind of an off-white or tan thread, all of the stitches are dashed lines. They're not a continuous looking line like in the other quilt. You see coming down along here on either side of the seam line. It's a dashed line. That's where the needle is manipulated to the underside of the fabric and back up. The dashes are in the little spaces left on top. The dashes are on the back. So that's one way to tell a quilt, hand quilting, is that it has that dashed line. Now my mother has beautiful, very even stitches. They're not the smallest stitches, but they're incredibly even. And that is something that makes her quilt more valuable than, say, my quilts, which I have very uneven stitches, and that's fine for what I'm doing. It makes me happy. This is a quilt that I made. This is the first quilt that I ever hand quilted, and this is made in a class. It was pieced in a class with Pat Weiss from the Silver Thimble Quilt Company. She's a pattern designer, very talented teacher, and she has a Silver Thimble Club, and I was able to participate for about 3 months before some family obligations kind of pulled me away. But I don't know if you can see that each one of these blocks is hand quilted with a heart and then a line around the outside edge. On the printed fabrics, it isn't as obvious there. I think you can kind of see that one. On the printed fabrics, there you go. It's a little tougher to see. Love this binding. This to me just screamed juicy fruit gum from when I was a kid. But when you open it up, I used a bright yellow muslin. And on the muslin, it is much easier to see the heart in every block against the plain fabric. So my stitches are not as even and perfect as my mother's. I just don't have the manual dexterity to hand sew that she has. But it makes me happy, and it keeps me wanting to work and perfect my craft. But the next time you see a quilt, look closely at the stitching. If it's a chain stitch with no spaces in between the stitches, then it's definitely a machine quilted quilt. And if it is done with, looks like a dashed line, whether the stitches are small and even or whether they're not, that's always the mark of a hand quilted quilt. So this is Jan Hatchett, your favorite jewelry lady, hoping that you'll give quilting a try one day, and I have found it very fulfilling, and I hope you will too. Thanks.